I think people need to realize is that's not you not being smart enough to get into med. It's a very interesting question because my favorite subject, I would say, was not the one I did best in.
Well, Isaac, very warm welcome to you. It's lovely to sit down with you and have the opportunity to have this conversation. I'm really excited to talk about your VCE experience and hear a little bit about what's brought you up to this point. And I'm sure that any of the students who are watching this will gain a whole lot of insight from your experience. So I just want to start. Can you please introduce yourself and what is it that you're up to at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to be here. So I'm currently doing medicine at Monash, first year.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Finished our first semester of exams, a bit hectic. And I'm also tutoring UCAT here at Contour as well.
Okay, great. And how has your experience of medicine been so far?
It's definitely been a big change from
Mm.
year 12. And I'm sure, any students would be able to talk to current uni students and be able to hear what they think of medicine. It's very different. The content is more in depth, but I think when you choose the right subject in uni, the right degree, then you're going to find it more enjoyable than year 12. Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, that's really what we're going to be diving into in the next little bit. Your experience of high school, were you studying in Melbourne for your high school?
Yeah, I was.
Okay.
Aside from the accent, I know, I went to Melbourne High School,
Okay.
so right in the heart of Melbourne, South Yarra. Yeah, and that was a really good experience, I'd say, definitely.
Okay. And did you start there at year 7 onwards? Was that?
No, so the school starts in year 9,
Okay.
like selective school in year 9. And before that, I was going to Bialik College in like Hawthorne.
Okay.
But yeah, started in year 9, a lot of new people to meet, very competitive environment as well,
Yeah.
I would say. Yeah.
Okay. Well, look, regarding school, clearly getting into medicine, you have done exceptionally well, and again, a big congratulations
Cheers.
on getting to that course.
You as well.
Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, so let's have a look at your VCE. Specifically looking at year 12, obviously year 11 is a component of VCE as well, but year 12, we've got a big year, big expectations, big aspirations. Can you tell me about your experience of VCE and year 12 as well?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think looking back, I'd say it was definitely the hardest year of schooling. No surprises there. And everyone would say that. But I also went into that year with obviously the goal of getting into medicine, doing well in those tests that you need, your ATAR, your UCAT. But beyond that, I wanted to make a change from year 11. And I told myself, I don't want to sort of look back on this year and just see studying and just see, even if I do well, even if I get into medicine, I don't want to say that was my achievement for a year straight. All I dedicated myself to was just this one thing, which led me to kind of delve into extracurriculars and those aspects of, I guess, year 12 aside from just academics.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. So what were those extracurriculars that you started like from that point on?
Yeah, the main ones were definitely school council.
Okay.
I got involved in that. It was called the SRC at my school, but same thing.
Yep.
And a couple sports as well.
Mhm.
So baseball and frisbee at the school as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So look, what drew you to SRC specifically? Because I mean, the choice that we have at so many schools, there's leadership opportunities, there's sporting opportunities, maybe there's some committees regarding some other things around the school as well.
Yeah.
What was specifically drawing you to SRC?
It's a very interesting question. I'd say I was drawn to SRC by the opportunity to sort of interact with others more consistently, and like do things for other people besides myself. I think it sounds kind of cliche, but during year 12, you're very focused on yourself and how you're doing and your scores and things like that, which is great. It's part of the process, but I think it's easy to forget that a lot of people are going through the same thing, and there's more to life than, sitting there and studying for hours straight, right? And so when I joined the SRC, I was really happy to have the opportunity to run events for people, to involve myself in others, with others in ways other than just studying together.
And in those positions as well, I mean, there's so much unseen influence that you do have as a year 12 student, regardless of a leadership position, and even just being the oldest student in the school. You've got eyes on you from students younger than you as well, and you do have a role of influence there So to step up and be in that counsel position does, yeah, it's not only benefiting you and your studies, as we'll talk about in a second, but also I'm sure that there was some unseen benefit you had to others that they'll carry on with. Like, oh, maybe I remember Isaac, he was really friendly, or he was
Oh, I'd like
really
to think so.
influential.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll touch on extracurriculars again and how that fit into the whole ensemble of your Year 12 studies. But to focus specifically on your studies, so your aspirations were directed towards medicine. First of all, what subjects did you take on in year 11 and 12?
Yeah, so I did one 3-4 subject, one accelerated subject in year 11, that was psychology,
Psychology. Okay.
psych, and then in year 12 I did English mainstream, I did methods and German,
Mhm.
and then biology and chemistry.
Great. Okay. So quite broad across the board. You got a language, you got science, and um, in your experience of that, did you have a favorite subject?
It's a very interesting question because my favorite subject I would say was not the one I did best in. It
Okay.
was probably the one I did worst in,
Interesting.
which was German.
Okay.
And I think the reason I found it so good was because, like I said, I had a bit of a mix. So I had my science, my math, my English, but German was sort of like a breath of fresh air, completely different type of subject, right?
Mm.
It's language, right? It's sort of like nothing else, as I'm sure you would think,
Yes.
having done a language yourself.
Yeah.
Um, and I think in doing so, like you're allowed to take a break, right? You're thinking about vocabulary and how you structure sentences compared to math and science. It makes it sort of more refreshing and
Mm.
allows you to sort of relax during VC as
Yeah.
well.
And with German as well, there's another factor to consider where that class environment and also your teacher as well probably had a bit of an influence over your enjoyment. And that's something that a lot of students will find in not only VC but school in general, that their class environment, who if they have friends in the class or their experience with the teacher and how they can engage with the teacher, is going to influence their enjoyment of that as well. But having a subject, even if it's just one that, like you said, maybe isn't your best subject, but
Right.
is a little bit of a break from the other one, a little bit different, something that um, interestingly, yeah, can end up being your favorite one, which is quite interesting. Uh, so yeah, like mix of English, mix of science, a mix of maths. One question that a lot of students will have going into VCE is, how on earth do I pick my subjects?
Mm,
Uh, Maybe they're in the position where I don't know what I want to do after school. I have a few ideas, maybe what I'm interested in, but just at the moment, I'm not sure. Others may have a really clear vision, and that may make subject choices a little bit easier.
yeah.
But the balance between subjects of this is one that I really enjoy doing, and this is one that's going to be favorable to my results at the end.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Year 12 does, unis will boil those 2 years down to your results and to a number. Uh, how did you balance picking those subjects in your studies?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I think balancing subject selection, it is very personal,
Hmm.
and it's important not to let yourself be influenced by others who may have picked one thing and enjoyed it. In general, for me, I think the first highest priority is obviously prerequisites for
Okay.
university. I think that's sort of just a non-negotiable.
Yeah.
If you're going for medicine, you need to take chemistry,
Hmm.
bio might help a bit, and of course like English,
Yeah.
something like that. Um, but beyond that, I think a common question is, should I take specialist math, right?
Mm.
It scales a lot, but I might not be that good at math. I actually opted against that. And so
Mm.
I went with German instead of spec. And like I said, I found it really fun. I found it relaxing. Um, as to like an overall opinion on what I think people should take, I think it does come down to, do you feel like you will have the energy, have the time to dedicate to these really hard scaling subjects? Because looking back, I think I could have taken spec, right?
Mm.
I know a lot of people who took it who weren't really interested in math and still did pretty well, because scaling is important to factor in. But ultimately, uh, you have to like consider what it's going to be like day in day out, because you can think of it, idealistically. Oh, at the end of the day, I'm going to get this many points scaling,
Yeah.
but are you going to be sitting there every day, kind of grinding out those hard math questions?
Mm.
For me, that wasn't something I wanted to do, so I opted against it. But if people can see themselves doing that, absolutely, yeah,
Yeah. Another culprit of that scaling, lots of hard work balance is Latin that I see quite a bit. Yeah, there's just so much to learn, but there's of course at the end of the day that really high scale.
yeah.
Uh, yeah, no, that's really good advice, and having, as I said before, one subject that maybe is a break for you, or maybe is that refreshing subject for which was German for you, can just make the year as a whole just a little bit nicer.
It does. I think when you
So
don't have
that's
to
mm,
manage as many really, game-changing SACs or exams, it does make those ones that you do have to deal with a bit more bearable. Absolutely.
Yeah. So when we're talking about your subjects, you've got a lot of workload to deal with. Despite not taking special, there's still a lot of study that you needed to do, and a lot of Year 12s will become quite stressed with the study and have lots to do. And we've also spoken about your extracurricular activities. We touched on that a little bit. How did they factor in? What did a day look like trying to balance your SRC and sport and also your studies as well, alongside other commitments?
Yeah. It's I think the cliche response is you want to do stuff during year 12, right? And I would completely agree with that. But to offer my perspective as well, I think if you can imagine having 2 hours versus 5 hours to prepare for a certain assessment coming up, right? You'd think the person with 5 hours might do a bit better, but you also have to wonder what they're doing with that 5 hours, right? So if I had more time for assessments, often that meant I would procrastinate more. I would sort of look at more inefficient study techniques, maybe just reading the textbook, things that aren't necessarily active learning, which I'm sure we could touch on later. Um, Whereas with 2 hours, with that limited amount of time, not only are you forced to be very efficient, forced to actively, break up, compartmentalize what you're doing with your time, but I also think, from a personal perspective as well, I think it's easier to study knowing that that's not all you're doing. If I'm going home and I know I have to get a few hours of work done, but I also get to work on something else that I'm really passionate about, and that might have been the SRC, then it does make it more bearable. Absolutely.
So what I'm hearing is that by having limited study time, as a result of that, you're sort of implicitly more efficient with that time out of necessity as well. And there's a certain amount of enjoyment that comes along, like you said, with other activities that you can engage in. And there are just so many. Looking back, obviously a lot easier in retrospect, did you feel that those extracurricular activities, along with your social life, along with your family life, were they helpful in your success in VCE?
I would say yes. Yeah. And I think it sort of comes back to that idea of self-care and not putting all your eggs in one basket, not really being the kind of person to just sit there and study 8 hours a night. Um, Looking back, I'd say I'm definitely glad that I took that route, took that option to do things other than just VCE. Yeah.
If we were to switch gears a little bit and focus on your actual aspirations. So when did medicine become a goal, a reality for you? When did you decide that that was going to be where you wanted to end up?
Ah, it's a very difficult like time to pinpoint just
If you had
because
to pinpoint,
if I had to pinpoint,
if there's no pinpoint, that's
my dad always told me that I should be doing medicine. He did encourage me, and I'm sure a lot of students are in the same boat where their parents are pushing them to do medicine, law, engineering. But I also found an interest for it in it for myself at around the beginning of year 11.
okay.
And I think that was probably good timing, right? Because that's when VC started, and I had to kind of knuckle down and study a bit harder. And I think knowing that you have a goal at the end of all of this, right? It's not just an unnecessary ordeal that you're being put through, but yeah, you're doing it for a reason, having a purpose, I think is really valuable. I think that's part of the reason why I was able to make it through without having a nervous breakdown or anything like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, like your subject selections are the end of year 10. So did that enjoyment, so that point in year 11 where you started to knuckle down, was it the realization that those subjects were more enjoyable than you expected, or sort of fit into that goal of medicine? Did that help you with your studies as well in
Yeah, I think when studying in year 11 and
Mm.
12, when you're studying your VC subjects, you sort of have two options. You can either treat them as a slog, treat them as I've got to rote learn all of these things. I don't really need to get this concept. Let me just memorize the definition. Or, and this is what I did, which I think was really useful, is I tried to actually gain like an understanding and appreciation of what was going on. So in year 11, my subject was psychology, and that had a lot to do with like how we interact with day-to-day life, right? If you look at things like how we learn, for example, I found that really fascinating because it had real-world applications. I could see it sort of working with myself, right?
Okay.
Same idea with biology, with chemistry, with those science subjects. I found them really, really useful in that regard. And I think looking beyond them as just this is my study design, this is what I have to remember. But actually thinking, yeah, I can find passion, I can find interest in this. Definitely led into that interest in medicine as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
I heard a great talk recently where shifting our perspective on our day-to-day activities is really, really powerful. And there was a specific analogy used where between I have to and I get to.
Mm,
And it's so difficult in VCE to adopt that attitude of I get to study or I get to wake up in the morning and learn. But even if one day a week or one activity in your week, you shift your perspective slightly and go, I get to actually do a subject early, or I get
right.
to take on a really difficult subject, which is going to push me, which might get me a step closer to my end goal. That may be a helpful perspective, and one that I think as well comes under that self-care attitude as well, because you can get bogged down in study. You can just become exhausted, become burnt out,
Yeah.
and having people around you that can help you make that perspective shift as well can be very, very powerful. In terms of your experience of your parents' influence on your subject choice, and you mentioned that
Yeah.
that's something that a lot of students may experience. How even from a younger age of year 11, they may say, "Oh, you need to do these
Stick to
subjects to get
the
to
math,
this."
the science,
Exactly.
right?
How did you how did you balance that with the subjects that you maybe wanted to do? Obviously, you took on the sort of the mantle and ended up wanting to aspire to medicine yourself, but how did you balance that with your own enjoyment in those years?
Yeah. It's because it does come down to knowing that. I mean, it's hard to say that you even know that you're interested
Mm,
in something like medicine, right? I mean, to this day, I wouldn't say I'm 100% set on it.
mm.
I think it's very difficult to say that when you are, 16, 17, 18.
Particularly 6 months into a degree, it's difficult to say where it's going to go as well.
Well, exactly. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't like to actively walk around and say I'm not sure about medicine
Mm,
even while I'm studying it, but I think it is important to have an open mind.
yes.
And at the beginning of year 11, what I think that looks like is not necessarily saying, I have an open mind. I don't want to commit to this. I don't want to work hard,
Mm,
but rather I'm going to work hard. I might see where this takes me, right? Because
mm,
it's a nice opportunity. VCE, if you end up doing well, if you end up putting yourself in a good position, you have a lot of options open. And really, I would say, why limit yourself now? Right? All it will really take is a bit of hard work, a bit of dedication,
mm.
and then you can put yourself in a really good spot for medicine, law, whatever it is that you're interested in at the end of the day.
And you're never going to regret putting in that little bit of extra
No,
effort to
I don't
set
think so.
yourself up,
Yeah.
even if you don't have that direction. Like you said, you've equipped yourself. You're in a position where you have more opportunity.
Yeah.
So I was like, we've spoken a lot about your experience specifically in Year 12 and in VCE. We've walked through a bit of your day to day and how the extracurriculars will balance with your social life and also your studies as well. The reality is that the study habits and motivation and goal setting and things like this are skills that we hone over time. And I'm really, really interested in hearing what did goal setting look like for you? So from that point in year 11 where you took on and said, yeah, I'm gonna fight for medicine. I'm gonna go for that goal. What did goal setting look like over that period of time? And then yeah, we'll talk about study habits in a moment. But what did the goal setting look like for you?
I think goal setting's pretty crucial,
Mm,
to be honest. I of course this isn't my idea, but I read somewhere, a dream written down becomes a goal.
mm,
And for a lot of people, getting into their dream course is just that, it's a dream,
mm,
right? And they sort of think about it like that, but it's sort of in the back of their mind
mm,
throughout their day-to-day life while they're studying, while they're attending their classes, things like that. So I think the first step for goal setting is actually being very realistic with yourself, right? Set a goal, even if it's high. I didn't achieve my goals for UCAT for a couple
mm,
of VC subjects as well, but I aimed pretty high, and I think that was enough.
mm,
So set your goals really, really high.
mm,
After that, I think it does come down to breaking those goals down into very realistic steps that you can actually take. Because you can imagine, I'm sure this was from my experience as well, I'm sure you had this as well, as you get home after a long day of school, bit of public transport, and you're just absolutely wrecked,
yeah.
right? You just want to go on your phone, scroll on Instagram or TikTok or whatever. Um, and how do you bridge that gap between getting there, you're sitting there really tired, what do I do? For me, what that looked like is sitting down every single Sunday, mapping out my SACs, my assessments, whatever it was ahead of time,
Mm,
and knowing, okay, this is my goal, right? This is, do well on this SAC, sure, pretty cliche, right? What steps do I have to take to do
mm,
that? And I would break it down into the barest minimum, right? Reread this chapter,
yep.
get a preliminary understanding, and then do this practice question set, right? Do these practice SACs, link the practice SACs if you
Mm,
need, because And this kind of comes into that procrastination idea as well. It's the best way to beat procrastination is to know exactly what you're doing,
Mm.
is to say, these are my goals. I have to sit down and start this at this time.
Mm.
And once you've done that, the hard work mentally is done, right? Then you're
Yes.
just sitting there studying, which does take some discipline, as you mentioned. And I think that leads into the idea of being future oriented as well.
Yes.
Yeah. No one, and this is of course VCE related, but no one in any field of life will do well, will achieve what they want if they don't sacrifice some things in the short term.
Yep.
It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have fun that day. You might say, you know what, today's going to be pretty boring. I'm going to get home. I'm going to get my study done. I don't have sport. I don't have extracurriculars, anything to look forward really. But I just have to sit down and do it because my future self will thank me. So in 1 year's time, in 2 years' time, I'm not even gonna remember this day specifically. I couldn't tell you what I was doing a year and a half ago from today, right? I'm sure you couldn't either. But it's those days, those sort of like nothing days that add up, right? Those habits, those daily practices in the long term become who you are, become what you achieve.
Mm.
And I think that's really, really important.
That's yeah, super duper important. Uh, and great advice for students as well. Part of the complexity that can arise with goal setting is, as we mentioned before, when you don't have a specific goal,
Mm.
when people are telling you that you need to study all the time and you need to make those little sacrifices, but you're not sure what's coming after school. And in your case, it seems very, okay, I've got this goal and I'm going to break that goal down into a collection of little habits, a collection of little milestones that I'm going to reach each day, each week. This assessment I'm going to do this for. But for the students who maybe don't have as much direction as you did at the start of year 11, is there any encouragement or advice that you could offer for setting those habits, for making those sacrifices, for potentially finding that motivation as well to do that work?
That's an interesting question because if you don't necessarily have a goal at the end of year
Mm.
12, like you said, you can feel almost aimless in
Mm.
VC. I had friends who were sort of going through the motions, just getting it done because they had to.
Yep.
And there's not really anything wrong with that. I mean, you don't need to aim for the highest echelon of uh, whatever university course after
Mm.
year 12. But what ideally you want to be doing is being deliberate with your time,
Mm.
regardless. And this was a trap that I actually fell into as well during year 12. There would be points in the day where I'd be trying to relax. I'd be like thinking that I'm finished with my work for the day or I want to take a break. And I sort of just scroll on my phone and not really
Yep.
think. Right. And a lot of people, just from speaking to them, they're doing that. That's their daily routine, right? They get home, they're doing that. They might do a bit of practice for the SAC that's coming up the next day, but really they don't have a set of achievements that they want out of that day, out of that week, out of that performance, right? And I think the solution to that, even if you don't have that big end goal, is just deciding to do things with your time that you really, really think will help you in the future
Mm.
again. So that idea of being future oriented, it doesn't necessarily mean 2 years down the track, I want to get an offer into medicine.
Yes.
It can just mean for this SAC, I want to be well prepared. Or even for today, I want to get this much study done. I want to get home and do this the second I get home,
Mm.
right? And that will add up. Again, it's those
Yes.
ideas of habits. Yeah.
Yeah. And the wonderful thing about year 12 and year 12 especially, but your VC as a whole, is your cohort becomes quite close because you're sort of all suffering a little bit
Yeah,
together.
absolutely.
And there's a certain bond that forms there, but there is also a certain influence that I'm sure you found that when you've got people around you, particularly at a selective school, and particularly depending on who necessarily you were studying with or who was in your class, when there's people around you who are also aspiring to maybe not an end goal, but just aspiring to do well at a certain SAC or hit a certain milestone, that drives you a little bit, doesn't it? It gives you a little bit of motivation to work as well. So how did the influence of others play into your study habits as well, into your goal setting? Were there friends that were also doing medicine that you could sort of have accountability with your study? What did that look like for you?
That's a really, really good point.
Mm.
I'm glad you brought that up. Social connection, social interaction, aside from being good for well-being, which I'm sure
Mm.
we can touch on later, is probably one of the major factors that drove me to do well
Mm.
in year 12, going for medicine as well. And I think anyone listening to this could kind of take that to heart as well as um, they say you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time around, right? I don't know if it's that severe during VCE because really you are still living with your parents, you're going to
Yes.
school every day. But when it comes to academics, it's really, really nice to know that what you're going through isn't so egregious, right?
Mm.
There are people around you going through the exact same thing. Sometimes it's nice to just know that, yeah, I'm suffering. I'm not really enjoying the study,
Yep.
but at least people are suffering with me,
Yeah.
right? And I'm not pretending that it'll be fun the entire way. There will be SACs where you're thinking that you really don't want to study for.
Mm.
For me, English wasn't really my favorite subject.
Okay.
Hopefully my teacher's not watching this, but um, like knowing that I had people I could talk to about it, I could work through stuff with them, I think makes it a lot more bearable. And when you have really, really high goals as well, speaking to people who also share those goals makes them a bit more achievable.
Mm.
I think it makes them feel a bit more realistic, and from that you can kind of draw motivation as well.
Mm. And I mean, you act as a source of motivation for others as well. I'm
Mm.
sure that people could testify that you were potentially a support for them, or potentially someone who drove them to do better. I remember some of the most memorable nights in year 12, alongside some of the fun events, were just the ones where there was an assessment the next day, or we were all really struggling. We just sort of
Right.
were on a call. We're like, oh, this is the worst.
Yeah, this sucks.
But as I said, there's a bonding that happens there, and there's a bit of drive, and you help one another out. And in the end, I think that, yeah, you're trying to succeed as a unit. One trap that I've certainly noticed was more present in year 11 and early parts of year 12. It sort of faded, was this attitude of, I'm running my race.
Right.
I need to do well for myself. I
Right.
can't share notes. I can't help anyone else. I can't talk to anyone else. What did that look like for you in your experience of school? Because I would strongly testify that working with people, as you've already said, is a really good thing. It helps your results, but it also helps your well-being. Did you find that there were people who were less inclined to talk to you, or to support you in your studies as well?
I think everyone's different when
Mm.
it comes to the kind of socializing that they prefer when it comes to study. I wouldn't say that I was the most social person when it came to study. I wouldn't withdraw. I'd be
Yep.
happy to study with friends, but I think I got most of my really focused study done on my own. I
Okay.
think a lot of people would. That said, I think it's a very underrated tool when it comes to actually learning content.
Yes.
You've probably heard of like the Feynman technique,
Yes.
explaining a concept to another person. I sort of adapted that to the times where my friends were busy and I had to do it for
Do
myself.
it yourself. And
Um,
it's also effective to
it does,
explain to
right?
yourself.
And that's a really good study technique I think a lot of students could take on board
Mm.
is you're trying to understand a concept, explain it out loud.
Mm.
And if there are gaps in your knowledge, if you sort of get stuck on a certain point, that means you don't have the understanding to explain that.
Yes.
Which means if they ask that on a short answer question, what are you writing?
Yep.
Right? You
You need
can't
to go back and review
exactly.
that thing. Yeah. That
Exactly. You
fill
sort
in
of
those
you
blanks.
notice the blanks
Mm.
by having those conversations with yourself or even others. And I would say it's probably the most optimal to have it with
Mm.
others because if I were confused on something, my friend could fill in the gap if he had a good understanding,
Yeah.
so on.
And,
Yeah,
and vice versa, you could fill in a gap for them as
absolutely.
well.
And
Yeah.
that just strengthens your own understanding. So that the idea of like competitive social interactions definitely happened. And I
Mm.
think, like you said, it was in year 11 more when people were
Yes.
very like they were almost obsessed with the results and the
Mm.
outcomes and thinking the next SAC would matter when it comes to getting into medicine. That's everything. And I need to put all my all into that SAC.
Yes.
Um, and yeah, like you said, it did dissolve during year 12 when people realized it is very collective, right?
Mm.
Your enemy isn't the guy sitting next to you.
Mm.
It's um, not really an enemy, but it's the
Yes.
paper at the end of the year. It's what you're dealing with.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. As a year 11 student doing a 3-4, that's a very interesting environment. And
Yeah.
I'm not sure about the experience at Melbourne High, but generally that like the group of year 11s who are doing a specific 3-4 subject is going to be quite small, and you're also with year 12s, so you're this little cluster of 5 to 10 depending on the size of the subject, that are taking on this more advanced subject. And that attitude of, especially at the beginning of the year, of I need to beat the other people in the group. Maybe that shifts more later in the year to we need to help each other. Certainly, some students will experience that they do form this little group where they help each other, they study together. They're like, oh, we're this group of year 11s, we need to beat the year 12s or
Right.
something, right?
Right.
In psychology, did you find that was the case, or were you sort of running your own race in that environment?
Yeah, I had a few friends doing psychology with me in
Okay.
year 11, and I absolutely did rely on them a lot.
Mm.
And I think I would like to think that they relied on me a bit as well, and I was able to help them out there.
Yep.
It was definitely a very mutualistic kind of interaction throughout the year. I think people realize that as you go into VC, it is sort of like its own entity. It's
Mm,
not just year 9, year 10, you get your test, you do the test, you prepare for the next test, right? There are so many things you have to juggle, and especially during year 11 when you're dealing with your first SAC or you have your first exam coming up at the end of the year. I specifically remember being so terrified because it's nothing like you've ever done before,
nothing like you've ever done.
right?
Yeah.
And you see the year 12 sitting there like it's not their first rodeo, they've
Mm,
kind of done this before. And you kind of wonder how they have that level of comfort. And I think that level of comfort comes from the experience.
mm.
It comes from going through that year 11 subject, even if you don't end up doing well, right?
Yes.
You've gotten a hang of the system. You can go into year 12 more confident, how you'll balance your time, how you'll use certain study techniques.
Mm,
But yeah, it is very necessary. And so I'd say it's good. It's a good experience to have. It's also really important to have that experience with others.
mm.
Don't feel like you're isolating yourself because it's a very difficult transition. And if you do isolate yourself, chances are you're more likely to just burn out, right? Have mental health concerns, things like that.
Yes. Would you say that the biggest takeaway that you had from that 3-4 was actually the result, or was it more the learning that you had from the subject? Which one would you lean towards?
I think it would have to be the learning.
Okay.
Yeah. I was happy with my result, sure, but I think looking back, if I had done the exact same thing that I did for psychology in year 11,
Hmm.
for the similar science subjects, biology, chemistry in year 12, I would not have done well.
Okay.
It was a very time-consuming approach.
Mm.
And on that topic of extracurriculars, I actually had fewer in year
Right.
11.
Okay.
I was spending almost all my time doing psychology, and looking
Mm.
back, yeah, you can rote learn, you can sort of brute force your way through a subject, but you can't do that when you have 5 more subjects the next
Yeah.
year, right?
Yeah. Even
And
with that free period that you would have probably gained from
yeah,
that. Yeah.
exactly. Like during that free
Mm.
period, you can't split that up among 5 different subjects,
Mm.
right? So you do definitely have to learn a lot regarding how to study, not just well, not just for results, but for
Mm.
efficiency,
Yes.
right? If you only have a certain amount of time to do well in a SAC, if that's your goal, what do you do during that time?
Mm.
That's the question that a lot of year 10s, year 11s, even some year 12s as well, towards the early part of the year, they ask themselves and they're like, what do I even do?
Yes. Yeah. Okay, well, you've thrown around quite a few buzzwords in relation to those study habits,
Mhm.
your active recall and the Feynman technique. What did study look like for you? What was that day to day? What was your how do I do this in approaching your assessments in year 12?
Yeah. I think the first step to effective study is recognizing your own weaknesses,
Okay.
recognizing where you are in relation to a subject. So if we take chemistry was a subject I really enjoyed as well during year 12. If I had a SAC coming up, my first step would be not to sort of just start at practice SACs or to see, oh, let me, I don't know, just read the textbook, right? But I would actually try to think like, where am I in relation
Mm.
to the content, right? A lot of people mention looking at the study design. I think that's really useful as well. I would be a big sort of advocate for that. Is I would have a look at the study design or the notes that if a tutor or a teacher gave me, and just think what here isn't familiar to me. Because when you're reading something passively,
Mm.
right, it's very easy to sort of read it and be like, yep, I know this, yep, I know this. You want to actually read it and break it down into, could I explain this to someone? So
Yes.
again, going back to that idea of the Feynman technique, but if you read about, what's the topic in chemistry? Equilibrium.
Sure. Yeah.
Sure. Right. If you read about equilibrium, you don't just want to read it and then say, reaffirm, yep, I know that. Yep, I know that.
Mm.
You want to actually be thinking, oh, but do I know this? Right?
Mm.
Could I apply this to a question? Could I explain this? Wait, but what's the difference between those two terms?
Yes.
So a really sort of like introspective approach to study at first.
Mm.
And once you recognize your weak points, from there it comes back to the idea of active learning.
Mm.
So if anyone listening knows about active learning, they'll know the main idea is there should be a struggle. There should be
Mm.
tension mentally. I think a lot of people don't look for that when they're
Yes.
studying. They'll get to a difficult topic and they'll think when they feel that tension, I'm not smart enough.
Yeah. I'm stopping there.
That's it for me, right? This is my peak. This is my potential as a human.
Mm.
Equilibrium's got me finished,
Yeah.
right? But I think people need to realize is that's not you not being smart enough to get into med because you couldn't get this topic. It's
Yes.
just part of the process,
Mm.
right? You want to sort of search for that tension no matter what you're doing, whether it's flashcards, whether it's explaining the topic, blurting, I've heard is very popular as
Yes.
well. Those techniques are really, really useful because once you recognize that and then you can apply this active learning technique to those weaknesses, then you will fill those gaps much, much faster than the person who's just reading the textbook, who's just sort of like reading over notes, highlighting things as well is like a classic bad example for studying.
Yeah, and as you read the textbook, right, like you're putting a lot of information in, and I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of the forgetting curve, how if you don't
Yeah,
continually
absolutely.
repeat the information, it's going to go away. Uh, I heard a really interesting discussion about how learning is essentially is not what we're putting in, but it's when we're retrieving the information that we're actually
Yeah.
able to learn that more effectively. And having those repeated times where like you're blurting out information or you're teaching yourself some information is going to consolidate that, because at the end of the day, your SAC, your exam, any of those interim assessments throughout the year 11 or year 12, you're going to have to, under time condition, a pressure environment,
Yep.
retrieve that information, put that down on the page in whatever form. So practicing that, whether it be verbally or otherwise, is setting you up for success.
I think you touched on something I didn't really mention, which
Mm.
I'm glad you mentioned, is you do have to tailor your approach to that end goal,
Mm.
right? And I'm not talking about the big end goal of getting into medicine. I mean, like you said, when you're sitting down, when you don't have any cues to, the textbook or your notes,
Mm.
can you retrieve what you've just learned,
Yep.
right? And during your study, again, it might feel difficult. It might feel like um, you're sort of not good enough or it's too hard, you'll never get through everything, right? But if you are testing yourself to that extent in your study, that's sort of like the benchmark
Mm.
for appropriate study. If you're testing yourself, if you're doing practice questions without your notes, without anything that can prompt you, and you can then think of a response that is worth full marks or whatever the criteria is,
Yes.
right? Then that's how you know that your study is effective. And that was my sort of criteria as well.
Mm. So with your study, we've already spoken about the interaction that you had with your peers, and I think the classroom environment is one that is severely underrated in terms of your interaction with your peers. A lot of people, when they go group study, they think, I've got my study periods after school, maybe on a phone call with a friend at 11 p.m. when we have a SAC the next day,
Right.
whatever situation it
The
is.
classic, yeah.
The classic. But the classroom environment can be really, really powerful, because when you are taking in that information for the first time, the person next to you, maybe they're writing the cue cards. The person on your right, maybe I don't know, they're trying to teach it to themselves. They're whispering under their breath. And not only are you able to bounce the information off your classmates, I think part of the learning that we get in VCE is we also learn how to study from our peers. And I'm really interested to hear, in both your 3-4 and in your year 11 experience, but also throughout year 12, did your study habits change because of the influence of other people? Did you notice something that someone was doing in May of 23 that you went, oh, I'm going to do that. I'm going to
Yeah.
try that. And maybe it worked, maybe it doesn't, but at least you tried. Was there anything that you took on from other people in your studies?
I think my study techniques were my own.
Mm.
I would say they were probably relatively unique. I'd like to think so.
Mm.
Anyways, I'm sure someone else would have already pioneered them, but I did definitely experiment a lot during year 11. The end result was that I sort of used a lot of Anki, a lot of
Okay.
flashcards. It's a great app if people don't know about it for
Yep.
your active recall, your spaced repetition. But before that, I had to go to a lot of stuff.
Mm.
Summarizing what my teacher was writing, reading over notes, as I mentioned, highlighting things that I wasn't sure about, um, doing practice questions as well. And what I found was exactly what we just discussed,
Mm.
is that no matter what I'm doing, it should be active. And so when my teacher was talking as well, what I found was the classroom environment is fantastic because you have someone who really knows their stuff, at least you'd hope so,
Yes.
in regards to the content, and you can bounce your own thoughts off of them. So when you go into that classroom, I would actually say you shouldn't be learning it for the first time.
Mm.
Um,
You should be consolidating it.
exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
and it doesn't necessarily need to be you're an expert by the time you walk in.
Yes.
If anything, that's bad. It means you've sort of gone too far. You've spent too much time on it. You could have been doing something else. But
You could also argue that you're limiting other people's learning as well. If you're the expert and you're pushing with those really like
yeah,
intense questions, and
absolutely.
everyone's like, I don't even know the
Absolutely.
basics.
I mean, that's a very
That's a very niche
it's a very polite thought. Yeah,
Yeah.
consideration. Um, in general though, like for yourself as well, is at least having a bit of a read of what's going on. This doesn't need to be active. This isn't like the really intense learning. This is purely just watch a YouTube summary,
Yes.
right? Watch, have a bit of a quick read of the textbook. Ed
Yeah.
Rollo is really good
Oh,
for this.
goodness, YouTube's a good resource as well.
YouTube's
There's
fantastic.
so many people who just have excellent summaries of 5-minute videos of things that maybe have taken you 80 minutes to learn.
Right. It
Great
doesn't
resource.
it doesn't need to be VC specific as well.
Yes.
Often those are the most boring ones from experience.
Yes.
The ones run by like various YouTubers. But what I find is, yeah, like you said, just watch a quick 5 minute video. Like
Mm,
get a decent grasp of what's going on. So then when they're explaining it to you, the idea exists in your head, right?
mm,
And you are building off of something that is already there. You have the foundation. And then from there you can say, okay, I get this, but what about this?
mm,
And then that's what your teacher's there for. Or like you said, that's what your peers are there for. They
mm,
might understand it, right? But having enough to go off of when you step into that classroom, um, it's difficult. You need to organize yourself very well to
mm.
be ahead of the content at all times. And I won't pretend that I was.
Yes.
But on those days, on those times that I did go ahead and have a bit of a look at the content beforehand, I found those were the most productive classes by far.
Mm, awesome. The last component of study habits that I think becomes the most important, arguably the most important, as you lead up to your exams. So those term 3 holidays into the first few weeks of term
Yeah.
4 is practice exams.
Yeah.
Is sitting down and going, I'm going to do my 3.5 hour English exam.
Yeah.
I'm going to put myself through hell to do that. Rehearsal is super important, and treating an exam like a dress rehearsal. Like,
Yeah.
I'm going to put a clock on, I'm going to just have my pen and eraser or calculator, I'm getting rid of my notes,
Yeah.
I'm getting rid of my laptop, I'm putting myself in a quiet space where I can focus. Uh, how was, I suppose first thing is what was your approach to practice exams? And then the second part of that is, how did that change with time? How did you feel you got better at doing your practice exams and SACs as well?
Yeah, that's
Mm,
definitely crucial.
mm,
I would say I think everyone mentions practice
mm.
exams as being important to success in VC. I think I'd like to talk about year 11 and then year 12 for
Okay.
this.
Yep.
In year 11, I sort of had the mindset that I wanted to save the really good practice exams up until the end.
Mm,
So I was doing psychology, and I think there were a good 4 or 5 exams for my study design
okay.
that I really wanted to save. And so I started with company papers, which were great, aced,
Good place to start.
psyched,
Yeah.
really good place to start, right? And that helped me address those gaps in knowledge. But then the issue was I left the VCA exams so late
Mm,
that I didn't really have time to review them.
right. Okay.
And I think that definitely was a bit of an issue when it comes to getting the most out of your
Mm,
exams. And so that sort of leads me into year 12, where I definitely prioritized the VCA exams.
mm,
I would say I had a very reasonable goal. I only finished around 10 or 12 exams for chemistry,
right.
a few less for bio, same with English, right? My goal wasn't to spam as many as possible. It was to do an exam, as you mentioned, as accurately as I could,
Yes.
right? Sometimes I was in the library and it's better just get it done than
Of
worry
course.
about the little details.
Yeah.
But in general, treating it like the actual thing, sitting there with your water bottle. And I found that doing that exam and reviewing it was much, much more valuable
Mm,
than simply doing an exam and, having a bit of a glance at the answers and then doing another
yeah.
one. Because your score's not going to improve if you don't review your
If you don't
exams.
review it, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest. If I had to give one piece of advice for sitting your exams at the end of year 12, it's when you're doing your practice exams, you need to review them.
Yes.
For me, what that looked like specifically was, of course, I would mark them, have a look at the score, oh, I'm doing so well, I'm doing badly, whatever it is,
Yeah.
right? But I would also keep track of the common mistakes.
Mm,
I would keep track of model answers that I thought I really wanted to sort of have a better grasp of,
mm.
tweak my wording in certain points. And also, I think just concepts that I needed to consolidate. I think that's really useful.
Very, very useful. The specific language I'll use for that is at least how I referred to it when I was going through my VCE, was a mistakes book.
Mm.
Is for each subject keeping a track of those mistakes. And for maths in particular, it was very easy to categorize
Yeah.
which mistakes kept popping up. Oh, fractions keep being an issue for me.
Yeah.
Or calculus, there's this one integration issue that in methods that I just can't get.
I always forget to add C.
There you go, right? Always forget to add C on. So keeping track of those, number one, lets you identify the problem, and number two, lets you tangibly go, okay, this is the thing that is the biggest detriment to my current score in this subject. I'm going to give my extra revision to that, or
Right.
I'm going to ask a friend about that, or I'm going to follow up with my teacher about that particular thing. So exactly, being critical, being introspective of your study, challenging yourself on how you've gone with your exams and how you're thinking through ideas as well, is super duper powerful.
I think just on that
Yeah.
topic as well, when students mark their practice exams, they're often
Mm,
very lenient with
very.
themselves.
Oh, very.
And I think people need to understand that the score has absolutely no bearing on anything. right? Unless you're telling your friends your score and you're saying, "Oh, look at me, I got this," right? It really doesn't affect how you do on the day. If
Yes.
anything, by being lenient with yourself, by saying, "Oh, they'd probably give me the mark for that,"
Mhm.
um,
Or I'll probably, I understand that I'll probably get it next time.
right, I'll probably get
Not
it next time. I don't need to, see what they wrote for the
yeah,
answers. I don't
I
need to
understand
revise them.
that's fine.
I get
Yeah.
it, right? That kind of thing is going to be detrimental in the long run.
Yes.
I would mark my practice exams as harshly as I could. It sucked seeing my friends say they got better than me,
But
but
you remember that the only one that actually matters is the SAC. And by
exactly,
marking yourself more
exactly.
harshly, you're setting yourself up, you're in a better position
Yeah.
to do
It's a very logical approach, but I think a lot of people miss out on that,
it.
purely because it is easy to be concerned with that outcome, that
Yes.
score, rather than the inputs. Yeah.
Mm. One of the most difficult things with challenging your exam scores and challenging your SAC study as well is actually challenging the way that you think through ideas.
Mm.
This comes back to what we've already been talking about, where if you've got someone else who can re-explain a concept or go, this is how I think about it. When I approach my argument analysis in year 12, this is how I'm looking at the piece.
Right.
Changing your thinking as well as also changing the particular let's say sequences of the question or particular skills that you use in a methods context, chemistry context, can be really, really helpful, because when you approach that question again, you go, oh, I used to think like this, but now that I'm thinking like this, I can identify something I didn't see before,
Yeah.
or I can sequence it a little bit better so that I'm in a more effective position to write about how the author uses tone or something
Right.
in the
Exactly.
English context.
I think that actually does apply to the science subjects pretty well
Yes,
as well.
I use English as an example, but
Yeah,
science is super
absolutely.
important as
I
well.
mean, you're more comfortable with English than I am. For me, English was just try to get it done. But yeah, with science subjects as well, I think biggest tip would be actually understand what a good structured response
Mm,
looks like. So when you're answering, you shouldn't be thinking, "Oh, what do I know about this? Oh, let me start writing." Right? You
yes.
want to take everything into account. The marking scheme, how many lines they gave you for the response
Yeah.
as well. It does
Yeah.
sometimes come into it. Those command terms that they use as well, define, explain, analyze, they all mean different things.
Yes. And they would have definitely come up in psych, bio, and chem.
Yeah,
They would have,
absolutely.
so having psych in your back pocket, you've already become acquainted with, evaluate, oh, I've got to do, pros
Pros and
and cons,
cons.
and
Right,
oh, good.
exactly. Yeah. I think that's another thing people need to realize is year 11 isn't about being perfect. It's
Yes.
about understanding the game, understanding what
Mm,
VC is all about. Because at the end of the day, it's just about what you can learn from it, really. The
yes.
year 12 subjects, they make up more of your ATAR anyways.
Mm.
They're more important. So just really get those takeaways from your year 11. Yeah.
So to summarize what we've discussed already, so VC as a whole, if you had to give one, this is a bit difficult, but if you had to boil that VCE down to one big tip that you'd want to give to a student, what would that tip be?
I think I'll have to copy the book Atomic Habits here.
Okay,
Um,
good read.
it's a good read. I'm sure a lot of people have read it listening to this, but it goes something along the lines of you fall to the level of your systems.
Mm.
And VCE, I was told throughout my experience, it was a marathon, not a sprint.
Mm.
But I'm realizing that now, looking back, when, like I said, I can't remember a single particular day what studying was like. I probably went to the library, right? But
Mm.
beyond that, I don't remember doing this. I don't remember doing that. I don't even remember half of the SACs,
Yes.
right? No one will at
It's
the end of year
interesting,
12.
isn't it, that
It is,
it's what
yeah.
takes up so much of our thoughts at the time, but we don't remember any of it. Like,
Yeah, exactly. You will be,
yeah.
on the other end at one point,
Mm.
but ultimately, what that outcome is affected by, and I kind of touched on this earlier, is what you do day in, day out, right? You need to trust the process. You need to say, and I know that's cliche, but what does that look like? It means actually every single day sitting down, putting in the work, even if your friends are out or if your friends are
Yeah.
also studying, you're kind of lonely, you're kind of bored, whatever it is, you have to trust that each day, putting in the work, right? Deciding every time I get home, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to start
Mm.
on XYZ, that will have a result in the end.
Mm.
It's difficult because just learning this one concept for this one area of study for
Mm.
this one subject, right, doesn't feel like it has some big implication on your
Yes.
goals on the end of year 12. But if you keep that goal in mind and then, like I said, break it down
Mm.
into what you need to be doing every single day, you will eventually get that outcome that you want.
Yes. No, that's, I'm really, really glad that you used that particular piece of advice, because being like a summation of your habits
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily just apply to, oh, your journey, I'm going to do medicine. Being a summation of your habits could mean, as a component of my year 12, I'm making sure that I go to the gym every day because I want to pursue professional sport,
Sure.
or I want to, I'm making sure that I'm brushing up on my skills because I want to go down a TAFE route, or I want to go down a
Mhm.
different route. Pursue media, or pursue arts, or pursue some other route. So being a collection of your habits, it is tailored to your end goal, or where you might want to end up, because your habits are going to change. And having people around you, and having some advice from students like yourself to calibrate those habits is going to help people with their success overall. So I'm really, really glad that you used that
Yeah.
particular piece of advice. I guess as we conclude the discussion around VCE, I really want to hear about what self-care looked like for you. And you brought it up a few times in the social element, but a busy year, a stressful year, I'm sure that there were days where, like you said, they were just super boring. You
Yeah.
felt stressed. You're probably just so sick of it. What did self-care look like for you in that time?
I think self-care, I want to preface it by saying no one's perfect
Mm,
when it comes to self-care.
mm,
I'm going to list a few things probably that I found very, very useful.
mm,
So sleep,
mhm,
fantastic, diet,
mm,
exercise, and social connection. They're crucial,
mm.
but that doesn't mean I was doing that day in, day out. I
Yes.
definitely had days where yeah, not everything went to plan. I was too tired to go to the gym, things like that.
Mhm,
But like I said, it is those habits that add up. And in terms of how that plays into study, I think people need to realize that um, VCE is more than just sitting down to study because, when you feel tired when you sit down to study, that's a product of how well you slept
yes.
or what you ate right before you sat down. Or if you're, I guess, kind of feeling mentally, you're not feeling like you want to study, not in
Yeah,
the right headspace, that
definitely.
could be your social connection and
Mm,
that could be how you manage your own stress.
mm,
And unfortunately, because it would be easier if you could just say, yep, I'm going to go to school and then go home and study and then go
mm,
to sleep. Or I don't even have to sleep. I'll just do the same thing back and forth. That would be easier. The really hard part of VCE, once you get to that level where you're putting in the work every day, is actually finding time for yourself.
yes.
Um, for me, like I said, there were a few non-negotiables for that. I would aim for 9 hours of sleep. I didn't get 9 hours of sleep.
9 hours is it's a
Very,
big
very
goal.
idealistic.
Yeah.
Yeah. And about seven and a
Okay.
half hours of sleep. When it came to diet, again, like I'm not talking about a caloric deficit. I'm not
Mhm.
saying you need to follow the paleo diet or the Mediterranean. Just
Yes.
eat relatively healthy foods, eat
Mm,
whole foods, eat stuff that will allow you and your brain to function
mm,
as well as you can.
yes.
Um, that doesn't mean refusing food when you go out with friends.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, everyone loves like an HSP or
Of
something
course.
else from time to time, but what that means is, stacking your chips in the right place most of the time.
Mm,
That's gonna add up.
yeah.
Um, as for like social connection as well, this is one thing I think I wish I dedicated a consistent time every few weeks to hang out with friends,
Mm,
because definitely did interact with friends. We saw movies, went out, biking, things like that.
mm,
But I think those were the times where, looking back in the moment, I was like very stressed and I was thinking, oh, do I have time for this?
mm.
It would be better if I was studying right now. But those are the things I look back on and I think very fondly of. And I also think that would have propelled me for, that night or the day after when I got home and I actually had to study.
Yes. Mm. Yeah, really, really, really helpful advice. The balance that we have between making those sacrifices to study, but also prioritizing ourselves, is a very fun one to achieve. And much like the study habits, much like your approach to goal setting, it is a skill, and it takes practice to have effective self-care. And there will be some nights, it's the reality of it, that you just are done with it, that you're just not in the right headspace, you're not equipped to do effective study. And knowing that point when you have read the same paragraph 10 times and you haven't
It's
absorbed any of
nothing
it,
sticking. Yeah.
you've got to change something.
Yeah.
If that just means going for a walk for half an hour with the dog, or having a chat with a friend, just giving them a call. Um, yeah, taking care of yourself, and also being aware of that. I think having your family or your friends also be looking out for you as well when they can see things that maybe you didn't notice about yourself. They go, you look really tired.
Yeah.
You look like you're not doing the best this week. I think we should do this. I think you should maybe just take a night off.
Yeah.
And like you said before, the temptation is just quantity, quantity, quantity. I want to study all the time. I want to fit
Eight
in as
hours,
much
ten
because I think
hours.
that I
Yeah.
can just fill my brain with all of this, and that's going to make it better. But I cannot think of a night where I took a break or took a night off, or left one practice question to go to bed, that I regret.
No, I completely agree.
Yeah.
I think on that topic as well, it's very difficult. It's like that introspective idea that I talked about for study,
Mm,
recognizing your weaknesses. It's almost even harder to recognize that
yes.
in terms of your own well-being. I've had nights where I would be scrolling on Instagram Reels for
Mhm.
2 hours just trying to take a break, and then I'd think I could have A, actually relaxed,
Mm,
probably benefited myself going to sleep earlier, or
mm,
B, pushed through, done the work. What I did was neither,
yeah.
right? And obviously, no one's perfect. Everyone's gonna have those nights from time to time, but thinking in terms of your future self, thinking, okay, you know what? Assuming the SAC's not tomorrow, you might have to push through it
Yeah.
if it is. But if you have a week to study, is the best thing long term going to be, forcing it through, sitting there not really being productive, or
Mm,
is it going to be, like you said, going for a walk, getting some fresh air, going to bed early, and attacking the next day with a lot of
mm,
energy, so that you can kind of have that outcome that you want at the end of the day?
absolutely. No, all really, really excellent advice, and I think that there is so much to take away for those watching in approaching their studies, wherever they are on their journey, if they're, earlier on in their studies or if they're right in the middle of VCE. And us two sitting here, it's much easier to talk about some of these things in retrospect and
Absolutely.
to go, this was just, yeah, like that didn't matter or that was easy to do because we've gone through it, and it's much, much easier to talk about it now. But for those watching, I think that the tangible actionable like skills and advice that you have given, I really, really do think will be helpful.
Yeah, I hope so.
So, Isaac, we've spoken a lot about your VCE experience and everything that was encapsulated in that. You had your extracurricular activities, you've got your social life, you've got your studies, study habits, goal setting, all of this. Uh, your end goal of medicine, and congratulations again for getting into medicine first year. Very, very exciting opportunity. I'm sure that a lot of people watching will be, even if it's not where they want to end up, will be interested in what the process looked like and how you approach that process of application rather, uh, and how it ended up. So for those who don't know, the medical applications comprising a bit of difference per uni. I'm not the expert in which unis require what, but generally, undergraduate medicine in Australia is going to require the UCAT, which is the clinical aptitude test that medicine requires, specifically undergraduate. And then we've also got the MMI, the interview, which is a combination of your ATAR and your interview as well. So if we were to talk about the UCAT, it's a pretty stressful test. It's a lot of people who sit it. It's very difficult. It's also something that you can only do in year 12 in combination alongside your year 12 studies, right?
Yeah.
So that's another factor that we need to consider as well. What was your experience at the UCAT?
Uh, for UCAT, I definitely would say it is stressful. I'd agree
Mm,
with that. I started around the end of year 11,
okay.
around the summer holidays before I started year 12, and my prep was pretty sort of meager. Like I wasn't doing
Mm,
that much until around early term two to mid term two.
right.
And that was when I really ramped it up.
Yep.
Those final 2 weeks, the term 2 to 3 holiday, I was
Hmm.
doing a mock every day.
Yeah.
It was very, very intense looking back, like very, very almost solely focused on
Mm.
UCAT. VCE took a back seat.
Yeah, especially in the holidays, you're like, oh,
Yeah,
take a bit of a backseat there.
absolutely, right? You're not going to school every day. You have a bit more energy.
Yep.
And I think the main takeaway people need to understand is it is worth, at least for a majority of unis, exactly the same as your ATAR,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is unfortunate. And you might even call it unfair that,
Mm.
it's 2 hours compared to
2 years.
2 years,
Yeah.
right? It's almost like not comparable,
Mm,
but you do have to recognize that and sort of dedicate some time to it, even though it
mm,
is a bit of an unknown. It's a bit out there, kind of abstract, very skills based,
mm,
right? It is still extremely important for medicine. It can even carry a lower ATAR or interview,
mm.
if that is the case. So, yeah, that was my journey.
As far as my understanding, the interview offers are initially made just based on the UCAT, and the following ones are made on a combination of ATAR and the UCAT as well. So a very strong UCAT can, as you said, compensate for maybe your VCE results aren't what you had hoped for.
Yeah.
I spoke to a friend recently who said that he didn't even know really what the UCAT was
Mm,
until only a couple of months before the test. And I think one of the challenges that we get with the UCAT is that some schools, some just individuals in general will know more about the UCAT. They'll have friends, they might have family, they might have other teachers or something that will
right.
go, hey, like this is what this is. A careers
Older
counselor might
brother.
go, you need to
Yeah.
do the UCAT. This is what it is. Start preparing here. And a lot of people will also not have that opportunity. They might not know what the UCAT is. They might not have the resources available to them. So we'll zoom a bit more into your experience of actually doing tutoring at Contour
Yeah.
for the UCAT. But were there any any components of your preparation that you would maybe recommend to just the average student who's considering taking the UCAT?
I think, as in, if I had to summarize one major tip
Yeah,
for the
one major
UCAT,
tip. Yeah.
I would say honestly, you have to have a very, very growth-based mindset
Okay.
for the UCAT, especially if you're dedicating your final week or two to just doing UCAT. It's easy to fixate a lot on scores.
Yes.
I personally fell victim to that. I'm sure you did as well. Everyone is sort of obsessing over what they're getting
Mm.
and what their friends are getting and what they need to get in and what's the bare minimum, what the raw score translates to a scaled score, things like that, right? But people really need to understand functionally the only score that matters, as we kind of touched on earlier, is what you do on the day,
Yes.
right? 200 clicks of the mouse, 2 hours, even less if you don't consider a certain component of the test.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so yeah, you do need that growth mindset when it comes to sitting your mock exams, reviewing them again, casting your ego aside, saying, you know what, I'm pretty bad at this question type.
Mm.
I had to do that a lot. My ego was absolutely shot as I prepared for
And
UCAT.
I'm sure you thanked yourself for it.
Absolutely, and
Yeah.
you'll never regret working hard. You'll never regret recognizing a weakness and working on it yourself.
Yeah. Well, we're talking about subtests at the moment.
Yeah.
For those watching and don't know, so the UCAT's got 5 subtests. We've got verbal reasoning, quantitative reasoning, abstract reasoning, decision making, and situational judgment is the last one. So your score is, and correct me if I'm wrong, made up of your 4 initial subtests. So quantitative, decision making, abstract, and verbal reasoning, and you get a score out of 900
For each of them.
for each of them. So total score is 3,600. The situational judgment isn't counted in your final score.
Thankfully.
Thankfully.
Yeah.
However, some unis will consider it as a component of the application. They may, much like with medicine, minimum 25 in English, they may consider, we're not taking anyone who's getting below
Right.
300
Indicating
or something.
if you're like a really bad person.
Sure,
maybe.
right. And then the situational judgment is just sort of analyzing how you empathetically respond to situations, for example.
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, it seems intuitive that you would lean towards one of those subtests, and we all have our strengths, we all have our weaknesses. What was the subtest that you found the hardest?
Hardest subtest, I think it has to be VR.
VR. Okay.
Verbal reasoning, yeah. You can look at each subtest from a time pressure perspective,
Yes.
and anyone who's new to the UCAT now, they might look at abstract reasoning and they might see 50 questions in 12 minutes and think, that's insane.
That's insane.
How am I gonna, 14 seconds? I think it averages out to per question. But in that abstract reasoning, you're noticing patterns, right? And there are 5 questions per set. So you get your pattern, that's 5 questions done in about 1 second each.
Yeah,
right?
because you know the pattern.
Exactly. But
Well,
with verbal reasoning,
maybe you don't, but
you hope you know
yeah.
the pattern. You think you have a feeling for what the pattern is. But with verbal reasoning, you're comprehending text. And that is inherently much slower. It's often a bit of a shock on the day if you get a passage that you're not expecting, that you don't really have any knowledge about, a lot of dates, a lot of names.
Yeah. Just length as well.
Yeah, like sometimes how are you supposed to read 2.5, 3 paragraphs in 30 seconds?
Yeah.
Right? Learning how to speed read is a component of that as well. And so for me, that was definitely the most difficult. Yeah.
Definitely. I've heard a lot of people say around the UCAT that, if I had more time, I'd be so good at this.
Yeah.
And that is, I'd be bold to say that it's probably one of the most difficult parts of the UCAT, is that the difficulty comes from the time pressure. To do 50 abstract reasoning questions in 2 hours, well, you could find
You could
this,
probably
right? Like you could have a really good crack at those questions.
Yeah.
Verbal reasoning, you could read those pieces over and over and over and over again.
Sip some tea while you're reading. Yeah.
Exactly, right. But it's the time pressure. It's the, oh my goodness, I've got this ticking clock in the corner of my screen, top corner, I can't remember. Top right, yeah. That's constantly reminding you that you've got to finish this test. And then you've got to jump to the next test, right? So it's this full race. Much like VCE, it is a marathon. Despite being only 2 hours, it feels like, I would describe it as a marathon, because you have to, while you are individually going very quickly in each test, you have to have that endurance.
Yeah.
You have to be able to have something left in the tank for when you get to the 3rd or the 4th test.
Yeah.
We've spoken, about the UCAT as being a really, really hard test, and you have done exceptionally well at your UCAT, and you've gone on to actually become a tutor here at Contour to help students with their own UCAT. But I am really curious to hear about your experience of being a student at Contour. First of all, how was your experience being a student here?
Yeah, I mean, it was great.
Mm,
Of course, like I was happy with my score in the end, but in terms of how the course was structured, I
mm,
really liked the fact that there were goals, there was like sort of homework set every week,
mm.
which you didn't necessarily have to do, but you at least had a framework for this
Yes.
is what it takes to succeed. Seeing that people have done well before you, that people will do well after you, that it's a very sort of structured program and you sort of just need to follow the steps,
Yes.
I think made it very, very accessible to
Mm,
me. I also liked just having someone who had done well to talk to.
awesome.
For me, it was Ramad.
Mm,
Currently, of course, I'm a tutor. A few other tutors as well are sort of stepping into those
mm.
shoes. But really having someone who went through the arduous journey that is learning how to do this weird abstract test, right?
Yes.
Having someone who had those same difficulties and who overcame them in their own way and can offer their own perspective, I think is really
Mm.
useful.
A test as well, which the majority of the year 12s around you won't be doing, won't even know the name of, right?
Yeah,
And it's this all-consuming thing that you are doing, or maybe the couple of people next to you are doing as well. But if you ask someone about it, or they ask you, "What are you doing?" You go, "I'm doing the UCAT." They're like, "Oh, what's that? I don't know."
yeah.
So
Nice shapes on your screen. Yeah,
exactly right. Oh, this is a fun like puzzle. Like, what are you
yeah,
doing?
yeah.
There's not much fun about it. Uh,
Oh, well,
the
you gotta say it though.
maybe
It's
it's
okay.
fun.
It's okay. Yeah.
um, you're the UCAT shooter, not me. But with the contour program, it sounds like from what you said that the talking to was there a personal element to the program that helped in your preparation?
Yeah, I would say part of the program is one-on-one
Okay.
consultations. It's small. It's a relatively new addition, but essentially, for me, I was able to speak with remote the
Mm,
head tutor for 10 to 20 minutes about whatever it is that I was dealing with.
right.
And while that didn't happen too much, while it was only like certain occasions where this one issue was bogging me down and I really couldn't work through it myself, hearing his perspective
Mm,
and just having sort of a voice of almost not authority, but someone who's experienced that
yep.
same idea, someone you can trust
Yes.
essentially, is I think very, very useful.
Yeah. And having that not only the academic consultation,
Mm,
but the perspective, like you said, they've sat the test before.
right.
They can remind me that, put me into perspective, pull my head in a little bit if I'm getting a little bit overconfident, or
It's not
give me some
just
encouragement as well if I'm feeling a bit down.
absolutely. It's not just like you should do this, 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 right?
Yeah,
It's more personal. It's
it
like
is.
you're almost friends with them. They're your coach. They're your mentor.
Mm.
They're more than just almost chat GPT telling you,
Yeah.
here's a plan for UCAT preparation, right?
Yep.
It's more than that. Yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons why the program has grown over the last couple of years, why students gravitate towards it, because there is that personal element where someone's checking in on you, someone cares about your success in this, and I'm sure that care is something that you're bringing to your tutoring as well. It's just checking in on the students and making sure that they feel like, even if they don't need your support, which I'm sure they do, but even if they don't need it, that instance, that someone is there to talk
Yeah.
to them about it, or they can check in or ask a question, is super duper important. So by the sounds of it, it was an incredibly positive experience, and certainly was an important component of your preparation as
Yeah.
well. So I'm really, really glad to hear that. Given your UCAT score and how successful you were in that, I'm sure that you were putting your name out, applying to lots of different universities. That's a bit of an assumption, but how many universities did you apply for medicine?
Yeah, so it's interesting because there are, of course, undergrad opportunities
Mm.
all across Australia. I wasn't necessarily interested in Western Australia just
Okay.
because it was too hot for me.
Yep.
Very personal, but just I prefer the cold. So
Okay.
I applied for the Queensland unis. So that was
What, going for the cold in Queensland? Yeah.
well, I was willing to make some
Okay.
sacrifices, but UQ,
Yep.
University of
You can. Yep.
Queensland, CQ as well.
Okay.
In New South Wales, I believe I went for the joint medical program.
Okay.
Um,
At which uni was it?
I believe it was, I can't remember right now, actually.
Okay.
You can find it if you search student medical
Sure.
program. And also UNSW.
Okay.
And then, of course, I went for Monash in Melbourne
Awesome.
and Adelaide in South Australia. Yeah.
Great. So yeah, really spread across. And how many of those did you end up interviewing for?
I sat down for interviews at Monash and the Queensland ones.
Okay.
I unfortunately didn't attend my Adelaide interview
Okay.
because of some unfortunate timing mishaps.
Right.
But yeah, I received an offer there as well as UNSW, the joint medical program. And yeah, I think that was it.
Awesome. Great. So lots of experience with interviews, and that's the final component of preparation that
It
we're
is.
just
Yeah.
going to briefly touch on now. The MMI is unlike a lot of other interviews that people may be familiar with. The MMI, it's a component of 6 stations plus or minus some
Right.
depending on the uni, where you're given a scenario regarding maybe health, or you're given some sort of complex ethical scenario, or
Emotional friendships. Right.
could be anything, right? Like
Yeah.
there's so many, and you're given a series of questions, which again, time pressure is an element of this. You have to be very conscious of time. You have to answer 5 plus or minus however many questions in a specific time, and then you move to the next station.
Yeah.
Start the
Just
next
like
thing,
that. Yeah.
right? Gives similar implications to the UCAT as well. They seem to like putting everyone under time pressure.
Yeah. Maybe it's relevant to the job.
Maybe
Maybe.
there's a
So,
lot of quick
yeah.
thinking and things like that, I suppose. What was your experience of the interview, specifically the MMI? And obviously, you've ended up at Monash, so that was the one you selected. But across the board, what was your experience of the MMI?
I think it was actually quite refreshing,
Mm,
compared to UCAT and ATAR. Because once you get up to that point, you get your offer for the interview.
mm,
They sort of know that academically speaking, you are competent.
yes.
You can sit down, you can memorize, you can understand the
Mm,
content. Really, what they're looking for is someone with personality, someone with something to bring, emotionally or in terms of empathy and how they actually interact with others.
yes.
Right. For me, what that meant was my experience was very focused on how I structure myself, how I structure my responses, and also just like the kind of person I want to be
Mm,
viewed as,
yep.
right? So during that period, it kind of brought me back to year 12 where I was saying I want to do more than just academics. It's really nice to have experiences to draw on
Mm,
as well. I did this when I was a leader, or in my experience with sport teams, I could do this,
mm,
right? It shows that you are a person, that you're, as a doctor, you're more than just someone who can memorize the patient's diagnoses and think of a response there, but you're really a person that someone can trust as their medical professional, which
yes.
I thought was really, really refreshing.
Yeah. I would confidently say that patients aren't necessarily asking what exam score did you get in
No,
second year.
no.
The personal and emotional aspect of being a good doctor and a good person alongside it is so important. And the integration of the interview, as it's grown over the years, has been really helpful in yeah, in achieving that in the candidates
Yeah,
that do actually get accepted
absolutely.
to medicine. I had the pleasure of helping you out with your interview
Yeah,
myself, and I know that there was a lot of preparation that went into that, and it was much like the UCAT, much like the ATAR, consistent effort, consistent habits, consistent checking in with people who say they know what they're doing, um, and yeah. So, what did your day to day look like for the interview? The wonderful part about it is that it's at the end of the year, so you're
it is.
removed from the VC, you're
Yeah.
removed from the UCAT, and you can focus on it. It is burning your holidays a little bit, but what was your experience of that?
Yeah, like you said, it is unfortunate seeing friends go away on schoolies and
Hmm.
saying, you know what, give me 2 weeks. I'll have to
I got to do my
I
interview,
gotta do my interviews. I
or
gotta get to
multiple
them.
in your case, yeah.
Right. But it's ultimately a privilege. It's
Hmm.
great to be in that position. And I think during that period, you can definitely take a bit of a step back
Hmm.
because they're no longer looking for someone who has dark circles under their eyelids. They've been drinking their Red Bull cans are sitting on the desk, right?
Yep.
They're interested in someone who is going to make a good doctor as a person. And so what that meant is, yeah, I would do some practice questions. There are like large banks online. I would take some questions from a bank. I would film myself, see how I look on camera, mannerisms, how I structure
Hmm.
responses, potential content of the responses as
Yep.
well. But more than that, I was definitely taking time for myself. I would cook something if I was bored, or I would take my
Awesome.
dog for a walk. Just stuff that you really will look forward to at the end of year 12 and think, I'm so glad that even though this is very important to my
Hmm.
application, to this goal that I've been trying to achieve for the past year or two, there is more to life than this, right? And I have
Yes.
time to do other things.
It's a really great attitude to have. And I mean, that you've referenced perfectly what we were discussing earlier, which is I get to rather
Right,
than I have to.
right.
And a difficult attitude to have while your friends are on school as well, while there's this amazing break after year 12. But
Yeah,
I get to complete this application. I get to,
absolutely.
uh, you know, get over the finish line, or at least give it my best shot, um, for all the hard work that I've put in before that. And that's super duper exciting. Uh, the interview, it's got a lot of complexity, and boiling the interview down to one tip, I'm sure that you would go along the same vein of be the summation of your habits, and be introspective about your learning. But being a bit of a different assessment, and still a third of the component of your application at Monash, or slightly different other unis as well. Is there any particular advice you would offer students to who are approaching their interview, or even thinking about the prospect of an interview at that
Right.
point of the
Yeah.
year?
I think the biggest piece of advice, again, not really on the vein of the whole habits, setting goals, but you have to remember the function of the interview.
Yes.
Um, as you told me while I was preparing, you're not there to write out a perfect 10 out of 10 full mark response,
Yes.
right? Again, they know you can do that. That job is done, right? You're onto the stage where they're trying to assess who you are as a person, and what that involves is showing character, right? If you're interested in something, you should mention that. You should say, "Yeah, I was actually really involved in this in year 12, and it lent itself to my response
Mm.
now," right? And that shows who you are as a person. It's more than just the average person who can think, "Okay, let me do every practice question possible."
Mm.
If they ask what I would do in this situation, I'll say I'll be empathetic, and that's not what they're trying to assess, right? They don't like empathy doesn't look like hitting these 3 marks. It
Yes.
looks like actually thinking through a situation, and they're not looking for the person who can mold their response compared to the one they memorized from 2 weeks
Yes.
ago.
Yeah.
They're looking for someone who can think on the spot, think critically, and say, you know what, if I were a person,
Mm.
an actual human, try to pretend to be a human for 2 hours at least, what would I do here,
Mm.
right? And if you remember that, ultimately in the end, you will probably be in a pretty good spot
Mm.
for the MMS.
Yeah. A part of preparation is being excited about being caught off guard.
Yeah,
And that's a very foreign concept, but
yeah,
being equipped to go, hey, well, this is a question or a scenario that I'm not familiar with, or has really caught me off guard, or has a lot of depth to it, a lot of complexity to it, but I'm going to bring the skills and the knowledge and experience that I've had to the situation to answer it the best that I possibly can. I remember one of the things that I said to you while we were working through the MMI was adding a personal touch, and it's a powerful tool in the interview to be the response that they remember, because you added a personal touch, you added an experience that you had, you directed a question through. Oh, in SRC, I had this specific
right,
similar experience,
exactly.
or in baseball, this happened, and this is how I dealt with it. They're the responses that they'll remember, and again comes back to being a good doctor, being someone
Yeah.
who has life experience, and can actually engage with the real world as well. So, yeah, overall, how was your experience of the contour interviewing? Did you feel like it was pretty integral to your success, or a helpful addition alongside what you were already doing? What was your experience?
I think it was nice guidance
Mm.
for sure. I think anyone can say you can prepare for an interview without tutoring, and I
Yes.
wouldn't pretend that um, I wouldn't have known what I was doing, but it is nice to know, for example, like those structured mocks that we went through.
Yes.
It's nice to have the experience of being shuffled around Zoom calls,
Mm.
getting cut off mid-question, and like having that beforehand, it really just comes down to that confidence.
Mm.
It's the exposure beforehand. You want to be in an environment that is foreign to the average person, to
Yes.
90% of people there, and have a bit of background knowledge.
Mm.
So you know what? Yeah, I know what they're gonna ask. I know they're pretending to be mean, even though they're not.
Mm.
I'm sure they're lovely in person. Things like that. Yeah.
Mm. Awesome. Well, to conclude, I just want to briefly touch on your experience now, looking back on VCE, on the UCAT, on the MMI. Now you're a tutor here at Contour.
Yeah.
You're a UCAT tutor. Why did you go into tutoring? It's a not something for everybody.
No.
And just doing well at VCE doesn't necessarily mean that people will pursue teaching or tutoring of any kind. What drew you to tutoring, and specifically UCAT tutoring as well?
Yeah, it's important to touch on is just because you did well doesn't mean that you're going to be a good tutor.
Hmm.
I think tutoring really comes down to, at least for me, knowing what I went through was extremely stressful
Hmm.
and wanting to impart knowledge on people who could benefit from that. And it's really that simple. I mean, anyone who went for med in year 12 would probably agree that it was very, very difficult. There were a lot of challenges, there were a lot of hurdles. Some of them I couldn't even get over. I'm sure
Mm.
there were things I would do differently looking back on.
Yeah.
But ultimately, being able to help students who are going through the exact same thing, add that personal touch again, just being like someone they can rely on, the kind of person that you would have wanted to rely on in year
Mm.
12, I think to me is very, very meaningful. Not to mention the applications later in life. I mean, you're learning to help others. That's very, very almost analogous to medicine in the future, right?
Yes.
So it's just very relevant to what I'm interested in as well. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, Isaac, we've had a really, really great discussion today and gone through some really awesome study habits, some points on motivation and goal setting and self-care, all in the context of the interview and VCE and the UCAT as well. So I just want to thank you so very much for coming in and having a chat. I'm sure that all of those watching will get at least one thing out of this,
Hopefully.
and will be able to take away that into their own studies, or maybe offer an encouragement to one of their siblings or one of their friends to keep running the race, to try this new habit, or maybe just recalibrate their thinking as well. So thank you very, very much for coming
Thank
in.
you for having me.
I really appreciate your time. Thanks, Isaac.
Thank you.